Good day, everybody, and it's good to be with you again on this Thursday. And I hope you're getting a chance to enjoy the outdoors today. It is a beautiful day, a little cold, but it's a lot warmer than what it has been, and it's probably about as warm as you possibly could imagine in January. But it's a beautiful day, sunny, whereas, past couple days has been kind of gloomy and rainy, and I know we've got some rain coming, so I hope you get a chance to go outside and enjoy the sunshine just a little bit. All right, what we've got to do today is I want to look at Matthew 7:24 through 29. This will basically end this portion about the Sermon on the Mount, and we'll continue through the Gospel of Matthew. But I want to look at Matthew 7:24 through 29. So if you want to pause that right now and go ahead and read those verses, and then unpause and come back, we'll discuss it. Okay. So, this parable, it is a parable. Let's start this way. It's a closing parable, too. This is what's really interesting to me. Now, there's a portion of the Sermon on the Mount that's also displayed in the Luke Gospel. Or it could have been the original. Matthew's added some things. Regardless, we have similar material in Matthew 6, and then also, or Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and that's also in the last half of the chapter of Luke chapter 6. But both of these teaching discourses, the one in Matthew and the one in Luke, both end with this parable or a variation. Luke's a little bit different, but it's the same idea, same concept, and you can see real quickly if you read it that it's based on the same concept. But anyway, this parable in Matthew, we'll stick with Matthew, in the Sermon on the Mount, it serves as a closing summary in a way. Has some other properties too that I'm going to talk about, but it is an illustration that is meant to summarize some of the main ideas. It's very broad and general, of course, but it is a summation, and it's an illustration. Now, parables, that's what a parable is supposed to do. So parable comes from the Greek word parabolo or parabales. Parabales, is the noun form. Parabolo is the Greek form. It still has the idea of throw alongside. So a verbal action, you're throwing it alongside. If it's a noun, then it's an illustration or something to that effect. Something that's being thrown alongside. But it still has that intent of something being brought along that's supposed to show how to apply these teachings into your daily life or something to that effect. It gives you some kind of application, but it's also an illustration that kind of sums up the teaching. Now, this parable basically sums up this teaching. It's reduced down to simile, and the simile is about a builder, okay, building on a rock or building on the sand. And this idea would be very... you'd have to be in the culture really to understand what's going on. Now you can see there's destruction going on here. But what is Jesus basing this destruction upon? So here's what's going on culturally when Jesus talks about this, because the audience knows exactly what he's talking about as he unleashes this parable in order to sum up basically this whole teaching discourse. So this is about the ruinous flooding that happens during part of the rainy season in this area of the world, in Palestine. And so this area is a semi-arid area. It is more desert than lush. Now, of course, when you get around the Jordan River, there's going to be some lushness there. That's why in the Old Testament you can hear about people who have slain lions, David slaying lions and bears. Well, there probably were some of these kind of predators along the Jordan Valley Rift. And that area would be lush. There would be lots of vegetation for sure. But apart from that, away from that, it's pretty desolate around in Palestine. And as you move north into Galilee, it starts to become more lush, but still it's nothing compared to what we are used to in southern Illinois. Nothing at all. It's not green like that over there. It's just a lot different. And so what happens in this geographical area is you have a rainy season and a dry season. There's not much in between. It's rainy and dry. And so during the rainy season, this is when they get their rain, obviously. That's why it's called the rainy season. But these times where there can be these deluges of rain. Now again, they don't get anywhere near the amount of rain that we do. But when they get it, they really get it. So they get these deluges of rain, and there's horrible consequences that happen because of the geographical features of this area. And so what's so interesting about this area is that the Dead Sea is actually the lowest, I think it's the lowest, I'm not positive, it's the lowest spot on the entire earth. Or it could be the desert out. It's Dead Sea is very, very close. It's one of the lowest, let's put it that way, areas in all of the world. And so the water runs towards that Jordan Valley Rift, because the Jordan Valley, or Jordan River, excuse me, runs from the Sea of Galilee down to the Dead Sea, and then it stops there. And so all the water runs to that area, or it runs to the coast. So what I'm saying is the runoff is east and west in Palestine. It's not north and south, which is kind of odd to think. So these ditches, these wadis, they're called wadis, this is what they're called, but they're just ditches. And they can be very deep and very wide, and most of the time they're dry. But when these deluge of rains come, you have this horrendous flash flooding, and it all goes into these wadis that go east and west, basically. So now the idea is this. It's the idea of building. So if you built on the plateau above the wadi, that would be like on the rocky soil, rocky areas. If you built on the sand, that would be like building down in the bottom of the wadi or bottom of the ditch. That's where the sand would be. And so building constructing some kind of a building on the rock would be very, very wise. There'd be stability there up above. You're not going to have to worry about the deluge of rain causing some kind of a flash flood, tragedy, a disaster coming your way, because you're going to be up above it and you're going to be on the rock. It's not going to wash away. But if you were a foolish person and you built your house down in the bottom of the wadi, in the sandy soil, then when the rains come, it's going to sweep everything away. And that's what Jesus is talking about. So these people would have known this very, very well, what's going on as he's speaking about this. And in fact, they would have walked away thinking like, no person is going to build their house in the bottom of a wadi on the sandy soil. Only an utter fool would do that. And so that goes back to the teachings about Jesus, because he says, a wise person will follow these guidelines. And they're like the person who built on a rock. And everybody would be like, yeah, everybody builds on a rock. Well, not everybody follows. But the wise people need to follow. They're likened to this person. Whereas the fool makes a foolish choice and is building the building area that he chooses, but also in the way that they choose to live their lives. So this is very, very important also. Now here's one other thing I want to bring up about this parable. It does give us destructive language and destructive imagery, and it is there for a reason. Now, the reason why, I want to bring this up again here in just a second. So let me talk about the opening and the closing of the Sermon on the Mount. That'll kind of bring some of this together about this destructive imagery, I guess, at the very end. So at the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew, and it's also represented in the shortened form in Luke, you have a section that we call the Beatitudes. Actually, they are more of they are blessings of celebration, really is what they are. The idea of blessing is just saying a good word. That's what it means, having a good word to say. And so the way that these Beatitudes, the wording that's used there is more of an idea of you've already achieved something, and here is the congratulations to go along with it, and all the good that goes with it too. That's the idea. It's more like a congratulations in Matthew, but it's about having these positive statements at the very beginning, a blessing section. We'll just say that, a blessing section. The Sermon on the Mount then closes with this parable, which is about a warning of destruction. Why does Matthew frame it this way? It's following ancient treaty practices. In fact, this is representative of the Old Covenant, the way the Old Covenant's laid out. When Moses gave it to the Israelite people, it begins with a blessings portion, and it ends with a curses portion. And so you have this idea of these blessings and curses that bracket this information. Well, this is kind of what's going on here, and it even lends itself more to the idea of Jesus bringing about new revelation for the new covenant in order to be put in place for things to happen later on as his ministry continues to unfold. But anyway, he's following this ancient treaty practice where you have the niceties at the beginning that are supposed to encourage obedient behavior. And so you say positive things at the very beginning, hoping that will spurn people to want to follow because they're going to receive these beneficial activities or actions in their lives. And it closes with this warning, and that's supposed to deter people from being disobedient, because if you disobey, then this is what you can expect. So it's following this ancient treaty practice that was out there already. Now, I do want to say something else. In this passage, in fact, it shows up, let me pull up my Bible real quick so I can look at it while you're looking at it. In verse 24 and in verse 26, we have this phrase that's something to the effect of, and everyone who hears these words of mine and does them, that's verse 24. Verse 26 is, and everyone who hears these words of mine and does not do them. So we have this phrasing here. Now, after hearing this teaching, I mean, it's obvious from what Jesus says. After hearing this teaching, the people are more responsible for their actions. So they are going to be responsible because they have heard the message. That's what he says. After you've heard this, then you need to do that. So if you've heard it, you need to do it. You've been given a warning, so if you've heard it and you don't do it, then here is the problem, okay? Now, someone astute or someone wanting to be overly analytical could look at this and say, well, what if I never hear the teaching? If I never hear the teaching, then I must not be accountable to it, correct? And somewhat in that inference you say, yeah, from what Jesus says, I guess that could be true. However, we have to cast a wider view here. As we think about what's going on here, we have to cast a much wider view and think about many other complicated issues that would come into this discussion. However, this is what I want to say about this real quickly. This is not an out for the person necessarily, but it is this for sure. It is an indictment against the church in some respects. See, these people have to hear. They have to hear. We're called to be the spokespeople for God. So they have to hear, so we have to be speaking. Now, of course, we should be speaking in a peaceful manner, in a polite manner, a kind manner. We should not be name-calling. We should not be retaliating. We should be sharing the gospel of peace, the gospel of love, the gospel of salvation that is encased in the new covenant. But we have to hear. And if it comes down to that people aren't hearing, then there's a problem. And the problem has to be the organization that God has deemed as his spokespersons. Now, I'm not talking about prophets or anything like that. I'm talking about the church and its role in society. We have a role. We are to be, as he said in the Sermon on the Mount earlier, salt of the earth. We are to be the light in the dark room. So there is something that we are supposed to do in this world for sure. And we know that we are also to share this truth about Jesus. So if people are not hearing it, it's because Christians are not living it. And Christians are not speaking these exhortations of the Sermon on the Mount. So for a person to say, oh, if I don't hear it, I don't want to hear it, I don't want to hear it, because if I do, then I'll be held accountable, that's a bad argument to begin with. Because, as I said, if we cast a wider view, a wider net, and look across the New Testament, we find out real quickly that theological assumption does not hold up. And I'm not going to get into that right now. However, I do want to say this, and I want to repeat it again. The church has a role to speak. And if people aren't hearing these instructions, it's not their fault necessarily. It very well could be the church's fault. And I think there's going to be some folks that are astounded when they go to meet the Lord someday to find out some things that they should have been doing that they weren't doing. And part of that is going to be, why weren't you sharing the message of salvation to people who needed to hear it? All right, so these instructions in the Sermon on the Mount, let's just review them quickly. Okay, now, and I'm just going to talk about concepts that come out of there. So in chapter 5, you have this idea in verses, well, I'm going to pull up my Bible again. Okay, here we go. Verses 13 through 16 in chapter 5 of Matthew. You have the idea of living your life in a way that is going to glorify God. So people who are in covenant with God should be living their lives to give him glory. He goes on in verses 21 through 25, and he talks about the dangers of anger. And anger itself is not a sin, but anger leads us to do things that can become sinful very, very quickly. We don't think very well when we're angry. In fact, emotions are not a good thing to make any decision on. If you're being emotional, you need to make the decision at a different time. But anger is one of those things that can lead to horrible things. So get rid of it as quickly as possible. Lust, he goes on, talks about lust in verses 27 through 30. Lust is a problem. It's objectifying people, dehumanizing females, actually, to some degree. But again, you've got to get rid of this before it becomes a bigger problem. He goes on to divorce, and he drastically narrows the ability to have a divorce. Back in those times, the Jewish people had developed, some of them had developed a vast array of reasons why a person could divorce a female spouse. Female spouses couldn't divorce their husbands, but husbands would divorce their wives, and it got so bad that they could. Some people thought that they could to separate from their wife, even if that wife did something distasteful. Okay, Jesus narrows it down and says, no, the only cause for any kind of divorce is sexual immorality. He talks about oaths, basically having integrity, being honest people. It goes on and talks about retaliation, verses 38 through 42. We are not to retaliate. We are not to be violent people. We are to be peaceful people. You could go back to the Beatitudes and see that. And so we're not supposed to be engaged in this kind of conduct. It's improper. He goes on and talks about loving your enemies, that we're to love all people. We're to love as God loves. Then he goes on and talks about generosity in chapter 6. I'm starting in chapter 6 now. He talks about almsgiving or generosity. Excuse me. He talks about, let me get a drink real quick. He talks about prayer, and he talks about fasting and how people are using these practices improperly, the wrong way, insincerely. They are not doing it in order to increase or to make their relationship with God any better. They're not doing it in a way to express gratitude. They're doing it in a way to bring glory to themselves. Well, that goes back to the very beginning. I was talking about that we're to live our lives to glorify God. We're not to live our lives to glorify ourselves. He goes on. He talks about laying up treasures in heaven. I do want to say one thing before I go on, though. These commands or concepts are represented in the New Testament in some fashion or form. There's no doubt about it. The idea of not being showy, in your relationship with God, being, a humble person, a humble worshiper, is across the board in the New Testament for sure. But there is one thing that is never demanded of Christians in the New Covenant, and that is fasting. It's not demanded. In fact, that kind of idea is never even presented in the New Testament. I bring this up because Jesus is sitting in a very interesting place in history. He almost has one foot into the New Covenant and one foot into the Old Covenant. Now I'm thinking, conceptually here. But Jesus is bridging. He's moving us from that Old Covenant to the New Covenant. And so he's going to be talking about instructions that are pertinent for the Old Covenant at times, and also for the New Covenant as he's moving that way. But there could be times that he talks about something from the Old Covenant that does not carry over into the New Covenant just because he's still living in that era. I hope that's helpful for you as you're starting to understand this. He talks about hoarding of wealth, how that's wrong. We don't hoard our wealth. In fact, we can be generous people if we don't hoard our wealth. And he goes on, he talks about don't worry. Don't worry about the things that you need. God will take care of them. Well, we can be generous people because we know we have a God who will take care of us. He continues on, talks about judging others. Don't have a condemning, judgmental attitude towards other people. And he talks about the asking of wisdom, is what I told you, verses 7 through 11. We need to have God's wisdom in our life in order to be able to relate to one another in a healthy way. And he talks about false teachers and about recognizing them. And so that kind of brings us, everything that's going on in the Sermon on the Mount. And these concepts are repeated they are repeated throughout the New Testament. In fact, I would urge you, sit down and take some notes. Now just think conceptually. You don't have to write down the whole thing. Just think, conceptually about what's being said. Have those thoughts in your mind, and then see if this shows up in the New Testament later on. And you'll be surprised how much this comes back. Most of it does, for sure. So now these people, in verses 28 and 29, I want to talk about this real quick and kind of bring this to a close. So after Jesus gets done teaching, in fact, this is the close of one of the teaching discourses in the Gospel of Matthew. We have 4 others coming up, and they often finish with, and when Jesus finished speaking, when Jesus finished telling parables, when Jesus finished speaking these things, teaching these things, whatever. It's always going to have some kind of idea of Jesus finishing speaking. Now, when he's done, the crowds are there. They are astounded. Actually, they're amazed at his teaching. They are amazed. Why are they amazed? Well, in verse 29, it tells us the reason why. He has the authority. He's teaching differently than what their scribes are teaching as. Now, would the scribes not have had authority? No, they would have had authority for sure. So I'm not really sure what is the exact difference, but this is what I would opine, because I don't have anything in Scripture. I don't know for sure. But just looking at the way that Jesus has presented the Sermon on the Mount, and the way he has redirected teachings, I think the people are astounded at the fact that Jesus gets back to the core of what the instruction was about, instead of trying to provide exceptions for the rules. So he gets back to the very essence of what's going on. He says, if you would just get back to the core principles and live by these core principles, then the outworking of that would have a extremely beneficial effect upon your life, for sure. And so I think they're astounded at the insights that he brings. I think they're astounded at how he's able to make this applicable in their lives just at that time. All right. I hope that you've enjoyed this, and I will look forward to getting into Matthew chapter 8 next week. So I hope you have a wonderful day, and try to get outside and get some sunshine today, because it is absolutely beautiful out there. All right. I'll see you on Sunday. Bye.